You are listening to a podcast created by the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. MAGE is a nonprofit organization of teachers, professors, and others who are dedicated to improving the teaching and learning of geography in Minnesota. I am MAGE member Fred Kunze. This presentation deals with the idea of geopolitics. In a nutshell, geopolitics is the study of the effects of human and physical activity on international politics. Some Minnesota standards are addressed in this podcast. It may be useful to have a map of the East China Sea within viewing during this podcast. Also, some devices or browsers will have the capability to show visuals, internet links, and chapter controls in addition to the audio content of this podcast. Kelly Swanson teaches advanced placement geography at Johnson Public High School in St. Paul, Minnesota. Kelly has a long list of accomplishments in his teaching career. He taught the first AP Human Geography course in Minnesota. He is the author of Kaplan's AP Human Geography textbook. Kelly is a reader for AP exams and is a 10-year table leader for writing rubrics for those AP exams. He is on the standing committee for the NAPE geography exams, as well as for the Praxis geography exams for prospective teachers. He is a member of the Center for Global Geographic Education through the American Association of Geographers, and traveled to India and Japan, where he co-wrote modules for studying those countries. Kelly was also a member of the committee which wrote the Minnesota Geography Standards in 2012. He is a steering committee member of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Finally, Kelly teaches at Metro State University part-time, and in his spare time, he is working on his PhD at the University of Minnesota. And now, here is Kelly, revealing to us a recent geopolitical problem in the East China Sea.
Thank you for your time today. I appreciate you listening to the issue of political disputes in the units that I call geopolitics or political geography. The area that we're going to be talking about today is the islands of Dokdo and Takeshima. Takeshima Islands are located in the East Sea, or the Sea of Japan, and the two countries that we're talking about here are South Korea and Japan. Both of those countries do claim ownership to this small outcrop of rocks that are really only just a little bit over 46 acres in size. The elevation at its highest point is 554 feet, obviously above sea level, but it is just a small rocky outcrop that 99% of the people in the United States have probably never even heard of, yet it is a big issue of national pride, both in South Korea and in Japan. Why should we care? And that is a big issue that my students deal with, as well as hopefully most adults should deal with. Why do we care about this small outcrop of rocks in the East Sea or the Sea of Japan? And the answer lies is that it deals with money, as do most things. These rocks have rich fishing grounds, and the fishing industry is big in both Japan and South Korea, as well as the possibility of a large deposit of natural gas. And with that comes money, and with that comes power. These islands, sometimes called the Solitary Islands or Dokdo in Korea, called Takeshima in Japan, which is translated into Bamboo Island. The two primary islands called Seodo, or the Western Island, and Dongdo, the Eastern Island in Korea, otherwise known as Orokojima, the male island, and Onojima, the female island in Japan. The claims to the islands go back as far as 600 years ago, with both claims coming from Korea and Japan. Two residents live there currently, and they are Korean citizens. There are daily round-trip boat trips from Uluwongo, a small island located just to the west of Dokdo and Takeshima, depending upon what you call it. 37 South Korean military do reside there, as well as 6 other Korean government officials, really to establish the issue of sovereignty on the island itself. The Korean claims date back, again, all the way back to 1417, when the islands were called Usando under the Joseon dynasty. The Joseon dynasty was what Korea was formerly known as, and it is the longest-serving Confucian dynasty in Korea's history. In many cases, under issues like postage stamps, the Korean public has really risen to the occasion in defense of the Korean sovereignty of the islands itself, as opposed to the Japanese claims. And the Japanese claims were started close to that same time, really as a shogun under the Tokugawa regime, when they granted the fishing rights to Japanese fishermen on the islands. Matsushima Island is kind of the jumping point for the Japanese to those 2 islands, as opposed to Uluwangul, which is the jumping point from the Korean peninsula to the 2 islands. In many cases, we have some historic maps that do provide some background as to who does own the islands. The first one comes out in 1530, and it is really the first map in Korea to actually use the name the East Sea, which still is an issue of debate for many cartographers in the world today. Other maps, such as a 1785 Japanese map, shows the island as Takeshima. 1673 map is going to show the island as Dokdo, and it goes on and on with different historical maps claiming ownership to the islands. But it is interesting to note that it does go back to the fishing rights as well as the seal population on the islands for a food source and for an energy source in future years as well. But Korean claims, again, can establish as far back as 500 years on historic maps. The islands really became a point of contention during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, when Japan constructed a watchtower for the surveillance of Russian ships in the Sea of Japan or the East Sea. That watchtower was taken down by Koreans when they reestablished ownership after World War II, when Japan lost the rights. However, the issue is further complicated by the fact of Dean Rusk, which was the U.S. Secretary of State, announcing he was Assistant Secretary of State, for Far Eastern Affairs, when he said that the Japanese ownership of the islands was supported by the United States, at least at that time in August of 1951. The Korean claim to dynasty will go back to the what's called the MAGE Geography, which is a book really known as the Essentials of Governance, and it was published in 1808 as kind of a guidebook on how to rule and how to govern the island or the peninsula of Korea, and then the islands surrounding it as well. And that does show the ownership of Usando, which is Dokdo, as belonging to Korea itself. Japanese newspapers also claimed ownership of the island, claiming pictures of it, and the animosity between Korea and Japan really extends all the way back really more than 100 years now, with the occupation of it during the early wars with Russia, and then as kind of the staging grounds for the Japanese occupation of East Asia in World War II. In his book, Lost Names by Richard Kim, he really kind of talks about the issue of the Russian occupation of Korea. And this island, I think, is a continuation of this animosity that we see. The issue is currently up for debate, but there's many U.S., or I should say many territorial disputes in the world, and the U.S. is involved in several of them with our good neighbor to the north, Canada, including the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is the border between Washington and British Columbia, the Dixon entrance with Alaska and British Columbia, and if those of you who've taken a cruise know the many islands there and the ownership of those islands, as well as the natural resources that are associated with it. And farther to the north, up in the Beaufort Sea with Alaska and the Yukon Territory, and the claiming of ownership of the resources which go out into water and oceans. It really is an interesting debate and an interesting issue in political geography that deals with UNCLOS, the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, on who owns what and where they own what, and where the lines are drawn really around the world. And this is a case, this issue of Dokdo in Korea and Takeshima in Japan, as an issue of competing claims of sovereignty over land in the world.
You have been listening to a production of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Background music is courtesy of Jim Hogue of Decorah, Iowa. The Minnesota Alliance is a non-profit group of educators and other parties who are interested in promoting an enhanced understanding of our world through improved geographic literacy.